My name is Dr. Lerone A. Martin, and I am the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor and the Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about your new book, The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, How the F.B.I. Aided and Abetted the Rise of White Christian Nationalism. And the first question I always ask is, how did you come to this topic and to write this book?
There were two events that led me to write the book. The first was the death of Michael Brown in St. Louis. And the second was an encounter I had with a colleague at Washington University in St. Louis when I was on the faculty there. So I'd set out to write a book on religious radio. And I had a coffee with my colleague, William Maxwell at Washington University in St. Louis. William Maxwell had just finished a book on the FBI's investigation and surveillance of African-American writers. So he told me kind of in passing, as you work on this book on radio, you might want to see if the FBI was surveilling any of these religious radio preachers. So that got me thinking about it. And then later that summer, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, by a police officer. And there's several ministers in the St. Louis area let me know that the FBI had reached out to them in St. Louis, asking for assistance, asking if the clergy would help them to make sure the city did not explode. And that got me thinking, okay, how long has the FBI been reaching out to clergy for assistance and partnership? So that changed the way I started thinking about my project. I stopped thinking about it as doing religious radio and trying to seek out Freedom of Information Act materials for preachers the FBI would surveil. And instead, I shifted it to who were the preachers the FBI might like? And that's what set me on the path to write this book about this long storied partnership between Hoover's FBI and white evangelical congregations, clergy, and organizations.
Yeah, that's a fascinating shift in perspective that you had there. And I think the kind of the first question getting into the substance of the book I have is, how did Hoover's use of these evangelicals, and especially I was really interested in how the Catholic, because of the fraught nature of Catholic versus evangelical and this whole, how did he use these kind of faith and these religious organizations not only to define the culture and mission of the FBI, but also kind of his idea of Americanism and how Americanism came to mean something. It was a coded word for something else.
Yes, John. I mean, it's a great question. I could see you read the book closely. It's very flattering. First, let me take on the Catholic question, in that, yes, America has long had an anti-Catholic bias. We've only had, Joe Biden as our second Catholic president after JFK. And Americans have long thought of this era after World War II, much of the 20th century, as being anti-Catholic. Americans not trusting Catholics, seeing them as foreign. But I think what this book shows us is that perhaps we've treated that history in a too heavy-handed manner. And that what Hoover's FBI shows us is that it really is an early example of conservative Protestants and conservative Catholics coming together and working together along the lines of anti-communism. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point is related. Hoover worked with clergy, both evangelical and Catholic, to, number one, authenticate the FBI, right? To show the FBI as being this governmental agency that was going to protect the soul of America. And he was able to get clergy to co-sign on that. The second thing he's able to do is to clergy help him sell the idea to America that America is a Christian nation, first and foremost, and should be led by conservative Protestants who have not necessarily the same theological commitments, but have the same political commitments. And those political commitments involve ideas around sexuality, gender, economics, and race. And Hoover is able to partner with clergy in order to authenticate this message as being what it means to be an American, that it's connected to the founding and not something that's been invented and created. And he's also able to partner with clergy to bring that idea into reality.
Yeah, and his own faith. I mean, one of the things that I was struck by is how he tries to create that identity out of like this wholesome cloth of Sunday school teacher,
Yeah.
this like American myth making almost in how he set it up, but then also how it defined his conception of the FBI staff and the guys who went out and did these investigations.
Absolutely, absolutely. And he uses his faith as one example of this Christian nationalism or this Christian America to really guide him in who he hires for the Bureau. He refuses to hire African-American agents. He will hire African-American agents to be clerks and to be staff, but never to be agents, even when they're qualified. It's not until Bobby Kennedy and the Attorney General's office put pressure on him that he begins to slowly hire African-American agents. And also putting his agents through a suite of religious practices or spiritual practices once they come on board. They come on board as agents. They have to sign a pledge to be FBI agents, which the pledge involves a commitment to being both a soldier and a minister for this America that Hoover envisioned. And then it involves going on spiritual retreats led by Catholic priests, Protestant worship services, all of which have the single message of the FBI is a bureau led by God doing God's work. So if that includes everything from investigating kidnappings to surveilling people's and policing certain kinds of political behaviors and expressions.
Yeah, and I want to get back to the policing, that expression in a minute, but I want to focus on now the very strange life of Hoover's kind of extra career of writing these letters and articles to Christianity Today, and what were they and how did they assume this life of their own? And how did it even come about, I guess?
Yes. So one way Hoover is able to partner with clergy is he becomes a contributor to Christianity Today. And Christianity Today at the time really was the intellectual mainframe and intellectual mouthpiece of evangelical Christianity. It is no longer has that position of privilege and prominence today, but it did during its origin in the 50s. It even exceeds the National Review as kind of this spokesperson for evangelical conservatism. Hoover is lionized by these individuals, which includes Reverend Billy Graham and his father-in-law, Reverend L. Nelson Bell. And Hoover becomes a contributor. He starts writing essays for Christianity Today. These essays then, as you mentioned, take a life of their own. They're published in Christianity Today. They are then the FBI, with the permission of the Justice Department, takes these essays, puts the FBI stamp on these essays. It says reprinted from Christianity Today. And these essays are sent out not only to FBI field offices across the country, but also to clergy, local church groups, Bible study groups. And you start to see preachers literally writing to the FBI, thanking Hoover for these essays because they are taking these essays and preaching them verbatim from the pulpit. And so what you have, and the FBI, their records show they were very happy about this. You have J. Edgar Hoover becomes the ghostwriter of countless evangelical sermons across the country. So people start hearing J. Edgar Hoover's words literally as the gospel. And that's where the title of the book comes from, The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover.
Could you speak a little bit about what was in these letters and columns and what they sought to define and create the contours of? Because I think the white Christian nationalists that we have today very much can trace their foundational roots right to these columns, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. They really are early. That's a great point, John. They really are early epistles that kind of set the parameters, the ideological parameters of Christian nationalism. The essays really present Christianity, a conservative brand of Christianity, as the only thing that's going to keep America safe from foreign influence, safe from foreign ideas around economics. And by foreign, I don't just mean by nationality or country. I mean something that Hoover will try to brand something that is un-American. So ideas around socialized economics, something America actually has, right? When you talk about policing and schools, and libraries, Social Security, et cetera, et cetera. But he will present that as something that is foreign and dangerous. And the only thing that's going to keep us safe is a kind of fidelity to a conservative Christianity, which involves having authority invested in men and men only, white men in particular, a kind of status quo as it relates to gender, sexuality, and race. And racism. So these essays present all of these forces, right, of whether it's crime or communism or changes in gender norms as being foreign and dangerous, right? And not as having sociological explanations, but as having explanations solely in theology and mystifying everything from the origins of crime to poverty and racism, and saying none of that can be explained sociologically, but can actually be explained simply by we have not been faithful to God. We have not allowed for America as the founding fathers envisioned is no longer the same America, and therefore we are in danger. Therefore, this is why America is falling apart, right? And he presents this constantly over and over and over again in these epistles, these essays, and they are preached around the country, studied in Christian study groups, and really helps to galvanize and knit together these disparate groups across the country into a whole. And that whole is what we know today as evangelical America.
And he offered a lot of support to these people, meaning pastors, even little old ladies running a PTA or church group would write to Hoover. And because of these essays and because of his status within the community of these white Christian nationalists, imploring him not only for a sort of blessing, but also to give him leads on potential subversive,
yes,
or communist, or whatever the word was. So they were seeking purity of their ministry, but also he was getting tips on potential subversive elements in communities, right?
That's right. There were political opinions, right? He was offering, which had more to do with punditry, right, than actual, rigorous research. But people were turning to the FBI as this clearinghouse of all things that were good and American, all things that were Christian and holy and politically correct. And Hoover is dishing out these ideals. And I think when you read these essays and you see words like communism or subversives, this becomes the popular word, you can almost substitute the word liberal or socialist or whatever phrase is being used by those on the extreme right the sentence wouldn't change. I mean, the sentence would still work because the way that Hoover framed it is still being used today. The framework is still being used today, that you don't engage those who disagree with you politically. You simply brand them as foreign, you simply brand them as an outsider, brand them as subversive, and then you dismiss them as being un-American, as opposed to someone who simply has a different idea around economic policy, who has a different idea about the equality of human beings, regardless of their race or religion. And Hoover was excellent at that. And he did it from the post of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is the top law enforcement office in the country. So when he said it from his perch, it had a great deal of power and political currency.
One of the strangest things I found in the book was the FBI was asked to investigate a Bible translation.
Yes.
And this, I mean, of all the things, there's another story which I'm going to leave out, but this idea of investigating a Bible translation, how did that come about briefly, and what, I mean, obviously they found it to be probably a front for communism, but what happened there?
Yeah, the revised version of the Bible, revised standard version of the Bible, the RSV, most of us are familiar with the new revised standard version of the Bible, but the RSV at the time was a translation of the Bible that brought a collection of scholars, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, scholars who came together to provide a new interpretation of the Bible that they felt was more scholarly accurate and more scholarly true to the original forms of the biblical text, both in the Greek and Hebrew. And there was concern that one particular verse in Isaiah, which many see as a messianic prophecy, that there shall be a virgin shall be with child, and the RSV wrestled with the word that's used in the original, that the word in the original could be virgin or also could be young maiden. Conservative Protestants took that and said, oh, this is a perfect example, not of scholarly difference, right? Or an actual difference in the Hebrew, but no, this is an example of subversives trying to take away Christianity, trying to take away the fact that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. Therefore, they all hate America and they're subversive. Hoover believed that. And so Hoover launched a domestic intelligence investigation on the revised standard version of the Bible and everyone on that committee who was involved in that biblical translation, trying to see if indeed there was a subversive element there by the simple biblical translation. And this goes to point, right, about how the Bible, and I would say even more specifically, ideas about the Bible and normative ideas around conservative translations of the Bible play such an important role in this Christian nationalist movement that Hoover really was a progenitor, for which he was a progenitor. And we see that today, right? We see that with the new Speaker of the House about certain ideas around biblical interpretation are still very central and play a very prominent role in our politics today.
Well, and I think it's such an important story, too, to link it to what happens to Martin Luther King.
Yes.
Because it's the same sort of ideological investigation where this is not the right kind of Christianity. This is not American Christianity. It threatens the identity of and the foundation of America.
That's right.
So
That's right.
I think Martin Luther King's story with Hoover is pretty well known, but I'd like you to speak a little bit about how Hoover viewed MLK as a subversive, not as a civil agitator, but as a theological subversive.
King is considered a heretic, right? And the thing about a heretic is that what makes the heretic dangerous is that he's considered someone who's on the inside, right? It's easy to dismiss someone on the outside, but King is dangerous because he's on the inside. So King is a minister. Hoover sees him as, at best, a minister who's been duped or led astray by subversive communists and subversives who want to destroy America. At worst, King is a subversive himself, who was pretending to be a minister. But the fact that he's a minister and is using American ideals and putting them in conversation with Christianity, particularly a Black Protestant Christianity, about the value of every human being, and challenging the idea that America actually is the new Israel. But America, as King shows us, right, has continually failed to treat every human being with equality and with justice. Because King is able to do that and start to galvanize the nation with this message, Hoover sees him as a very dangerous threat. And as possibly, perhaps in the language Hoover will use in the late 60s, concerns that King might be a Black Messiah who's going to bring people together. And that's the quote, right? It's important. It says the Black Messiah. He's concerned that King might be this Black Messiah who's going to bring disparate groups together and unify them for the cause of equality. And Hoover is concerned about him. So whenever to defeat him, many of us know the story that he engages in a surveillance campaign that we just literally marked 60 years since that campaign started in October of 1963. What people did not know, and I tried to highlight in the book, is that Hoover actually taps an African-American evangelical minister, right, to launder some of their intelligence about King, counterintelligence, excuse me, I should say, in order to discredit King as a minister, right? But to show that King is not a minister, these ideas are not biblical, but actually these ideas, Hoover wants to say, are foreign and subversive. And that's the way that Hoover really goes about this campaign against King. And if you don't include this idea of a fight between competing Christianities, you do miss a very vital aspect of this FBI campaign against King.
Well, and I think that Elder Michelou, I think is how you say his name, is
Michelle, yes, Michelle.
Yeah. Is it illustrative of a couple of things? And one of the things in kind of our modern sensibility, I kept reading the book thinking very cynically that Hoover was doing this as a political tactic.
Yes.
He was using these evangelical preachers and these groups of white people who believed in the Bible as a tool. But you argue that he actually believed this, and it wasn't a cynical ploy. It wasn't a counterintelligence operation. This was what he believed, and this defines the FBI, correct?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to point out that it's not a ruse, that it's important to point out that this is something that Hoover really believed. And if we can do that, then we can really trace, have an account for what we see today in our politics. And we can actually try to engage people at that level, as opposed to dismissing them as being somehow disingenuous, right? That you're not really a Christian if you believe that. Well, if we engage from that perspective, we're in some ways doing the same thing that Hoover and others do, right, to those on the other side of the aisle. So I think if we take this conversation seriously, it will allow us to have serious conversation and able to understand the worldview of those who really believe America should be a white Christian nation. This is not a ruse. This is a long tradition within American Christianity that I tried to point out at least how it expressed itself in the mid 20th century. And it's something that continues today. And if we don't take Hoover's perspective seriously, we have a difficult time taking what's happening today seriously and not dismissing it as some ruse. But actually, this is a long-standing tradition in America. And if we're going to ever find a way to get beyond it, we have to first acknowledge it, acknowledge that it is real, acknowledge its roots, and then we can perhaps then come together and figure out some solutions of how to move America forward to be a more democratic nation.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And the final question I would have for you is, if you take the white out of it, does it make the Christian nationalist movement any less potent?
Oh man, I think I do think there are different versions of a kind of Christian nationalism, if you will. You could arguably say that King's idea of America and the SCLC's motto of saving the soul of America is an expression of applying Christian ideals to American democratic practice. The difference is that the white Christian nationalism has a long history of dominance, of trying to dominate and trying to oppress all of those who aren't white. King's Black Protestant idea of applying Christian principles to American governance has at its core human flourishing, has at its core equality, has at its core a justice, concern for the poor. So I think that white Christian nationalism is important because it links it to a long history of racialized dominance and oppression.